I thought I had the perfect life until I caught my wife cheating with multiple men. When I confronted her, instead of apologizing, she looked me dead in the eyes and said, "Nothing will save you from this. I'm going to make you suffer until you die." Then she grabbed a knife, sliced her own arm, and called 911. As police dragged me away in handcuffs, I realized this wasn't just about infidelity. It was a calculated plan to destroy me completely. But she made one critical mistake. My name is Andrew Wilson. I'm 52 years old, and until last year, I thought I had what most people would call a good life. I had a beautiful home in a nice suburb outside of Boston, a steady income that kept us comfortable, and a marriage of 17 years to a woman I truly believed was the love of my life. Becky and I have a son, Tyler, who just turned 15. He's the real victim in all of this. When I first met Rebecca Collins, Becky to everyone who knew her, I was knocked off my feet. She had this laugh that could light up a room and these sharp blue eyes that seemed to see right through you. She was ambitious, confident, worked for a high-end marketing firm, and somehow she chose me. We dated for 2 years before I proposed, and when she said yes, I thought I'd won the lottery. The first few years were good, great even. We traveled, bought our house, and eventually welcomed Tyler. Life was falling into place exactly as I'd hoped. Even when things got tough, I reminded myself that every marriage hits rough patches. My own parents divorced when I was 7, and I promised myself I'd never put my kid through that. Maybe that's why I ignored the signs for so long. It started small. Becky began cutting me off mid-sentence at dinner parties, laughing a little too hard when I misspoke, rolling her eyes when I shared an opinion. "Andrew's just being Andrew," she'd say, as if my thoughts were some kind of joke. I told myself it was nothing, just her way of teasing. But over time, these small disrespect piled up. Then came the distance. Becky started working later, attending more client meetings and team-building workshops. Our conversations grew shorter, more functional. "Did you pick up Tyler? Is the mortgage paid?" It was like living with a business partner rather than a wife. I tried everything to reconnect. Date nights, weekend getaways, even marriage counseling for a brief stint. Becky went along with it all, but her heart wasn't in it. She was physically present, but emotionally checked out. "You're overthinking things," she'd tell me whenever I tried to talk about it. "I'm just busy with work. Not everything is about your feelings, Andrew." By then, her phone had become an extension of her hand. She guarded it like Fort Knox, password protected, face always turned away from me, notification silenced but constantly lighting up. If I walked into a room while she was texting, she'd quickly lock the screen and put it down. When I asked who she was talking to, the answer was always vague. "Just work stuff," or "just catching up with Sarah." I'm not proud to admit that I started watching her more closely, not following her or checking her things. I still respected her privacy, but I noticed patterns. The same block number calling late at night. The mysterious weekend conferences that seemed to have no online presence. The new clothes and lingerie she never wore around me. I didn't want to be the jealous husband. I didn't want to believe what my gut was telling me. But as the months passed, I couldn't ignore the sinking feeling that the woman I loved was slipping away, or worse, had already gone. I'm not the type of man who jumps to conclusions. My father always told me to gather facts before making accusations. "Measure twice, cut once," he'd say. So despite my suspicions about Becky, I wanted concrete evidence before confronting her. The problem was, I couldn't be in 2 places at once. I had to keep my job. Someone had to pay for Tyler's college fund and our mortgage, which meant I couldn't spend my days following my wife around town. The breaking point came on a Tuesday night in March. Becky had told me she was attending a marketing conference in Chicago for 3 days. She kissed Tyler and me goodbye, wheeled her suitcase to her car, and drove off. That evening, I was helping Tyler with his math homework when my phone buzzed. It was Jim, a colleague of mine. "Hey, Andrew. Quick question about the Henderson project. Also, just ran into Becky at Riverside Mall. Tell her those shoes she was looking at would look great on her." My blood ran cold. "Becky's in Chicago," I said slowly. A pause. "Well, unless she has a twin sister, I just saw her about 15 minutes ago at the Nordstrom entrance with some guy. Tall fellow, gray at the temples, expensive-looking suit." I mumbled something about a misunderstanding and hung up. My hand was shaking so badly I could hardly hold my phone. Tyler was staring at me, pencil frozen mid-equation. "Everything okay, Dad?" I forced a smile. Yeah, buddy. Just a mix-up at work. I helped him finish his homework, made dinner, and went through the motions of our evening routine while my mind raced. After Tyler went to bed, I sat in the dark kitchen for hours, weighing my options. The next morning, I called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years. Once Tyler left for school, I started searching. I checked our shared credit card statements online. There were charges at restaurants I'd never been to, a hotel downtown from 2 months ago, and several large purchases at stores that sold women's clothing, all on days Becky had told me she was working late. I checked her phone records next. The same unidentified number appeared dozens of times, often late at night, or during her supposed business trips. The call sometimes lasted for hours. But the real gut punch came when I looked through our family photo cloud account. I was searching for a picture of Tyler for a school project when I noticed a folder I didn't recognize. It required a password, but after a few attempts, her birthday, our anniversary, Tyler's birthday, I tried her mother's maiden name. The folder opened, revealing hundreds of messages between Becky and not one, but 3 different men. There were intimate photos she'd sent them, explicit texts, and even videos that made me physically ill. Worse, there were screenshots of conversations where she mocked me to these men, calling me boring, predictable, and worst of all, sharing private details about her marriage that no one else should have known. My hands were trembling as I downloaded everything to a secure hard drive. In the messages, she'd mentioned meetings at the Riverfront Hotel and clandestine rendezvous at a lake house owned by someone named Marcus. The dates lined up perfectly with her work conferences and girls' weekends. I sat back in my chair, feeling like I'd been punched in the stomach. The evidence was irrefutable. The woman I'd built my life with, the mother of my son, had been living a double life right under my nose. The betrayal wasn't just sexual. It was a complete mockery of our marriage, our family, and me. I had decisions to make. Confront her immediately, wait until she returned from her fake conference, file for divorce without saying a word. I couldn't think straight. But one thing became crystal clear. I needed professional help to navigate this mess. If Becky was this calculating in her affairs, who knew what she might do when cornered? After discovering the extent of Becky's betrayal, I spent 2 days in a fog of anger and disbelief. I considered calling her immediately, but decided against it. I needed to face her in person, see her eyes when I confronted her with the truth. On the 3rd day of her Chicago conference, I arranged for Tyler to stay overnight at his friend's house. When Becky's car pulled into our driveway that evening, I was waiting in the living room with the lights dimmed. She walked in, rolling her suitcase behind her, humming softly to herself. She jumped when she saw me sitting there. "Andrew, you startled me," she said, her hand flying to her chest. "Why are you sitting in the dark? How was Chicago?" I asked calmly. "Exhausting. The keynote speaker was a total bore, but the networking was worth it." She launched into a detailed account of a conference that never happened, describing panels and people who didn't exist. I let her talk, watching her weave lies with practiced ease. When she finally paused, I simply said, "Jim saw you at Riverside Mall on Tuesday, with a man in an expensive suit." Her expression froze for a split second before she recovered. Jim must have been mistaken. I was obviously in Chicago. "No, Becky, you weren't." I pulled out my laptop and turned it to face her. "You were at the Riverfront Hotel with a man named Marcus 2 weeks ago. Before that, you were with someone named Richard at that new restaurant downtown." I played a video from the folder I discovered. Just a few seconds, enough to make my point. Her face drained of color. "You went through my private files? That's invasion of privacy. How dare you spy on me?" I laughed bitterly. "That's what concerns you? Not the fact that you've been sleeping with multiple men behind my back. Not the texts where you mock our marriage." "You don't understand," she stammered. "It's not what it looks like." "Then what is it, Becky?" "Because it looks like my wife of 17 years has been living a double life." Her demeanor suddenly changed. The panic vanished, replaced by cold fury. "Fine. You want the truth. I've been unhappy for years. You're boring, Andrew. Predictable. Always the same routine, same conversations, same mediocre life." Her words cut deep, but I didn't let it show. "So, instead of talking to me or filing for divorce, you decided to cheat on me with 3 different men? To lie to our faces every day." "Those men appreciate me," she hissed. "They see my value. They're successful, exciting, Everything you're not. And what about Tyler? Did you consider him when you were destroying our family? Something flickered in her eyes, the first sign of real emotion. But it vanished quickly. Tyler will be fine. Kids are resilient. I stood up slowly. I want a divorce, Becky. I've already spoken to a lawyer. You've what? For the first time, she looked rattled. You had no right to do that without talking to me first. Like you talked to me before sleeping with half of Boston. Her eyes narrowed dangerously. You think you're so clever, but you have no idea what's coming. I should have seen it coming. The wild look in Becky's eyes should have warned me, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened next. After our confrontation, Becky stormed upstairs. I stayed in the living room, trying to process everything. 20 minutes of silence passed before I heard her footsteps on the stairs. She walked back into the living room, oddly calm. Her eyes were red from crying, but there was something else there, a cold determination that sent chills down my spine. Andrew, I'm sorry, she said quietly. This isn't how I wanted things to end. For a moment, I thought she was genuinely remorseful. I was wrong. I need some water, she muttered, heading to the kitchen. I heard the cabinet open, the faucet run, then a sudden crash followed by a blood-curdling scream. I rushed into the kitchen to find Becky on the floor, clutching her arm. Blood seeped between her fingers from a deep cut. A broken glass lay shattered beside her. What happened? I asked, reaching for a dish towel to stop the bleeding. As I approached, Becky's expression changed. She scrambled away from me, terror on her face. Stay away from me, she screamed. Confused, I froze. Becky, you're bleeding. Let me help. She pulled out her phone with her good hand. Help, she yelled into it. My husband attacked me. He has a knife. I looked down. In my confusion, I had picked up a knife from the counter instead of towel. I hadn't even realized I was holding it. Becky, what are you doing? I whispered, setting the knife down slowly. Her eyes locked with mine, cold and calculating. My wife looked me dead in the eyes and said, Nothing will save you from this. I'm going to make you suffer until you die. Before I could even react, she dialed 911. Please help me, she sobbed into the phone. My husband cut me with a knife. I think he's going to kill me. Please hurry. I stood there, paralyzed with shock. This couldn't be happening. I scrambled for my own phone, desperately trying to start recording. Becky noticed. Who are you texting? She demanded. Why I didn't answer? Her face hardened. It doesn't matter. No one will believe you over me. Minutes later, sirens wailed in the distance. Blue and red lights flashed through our windows. As officers pounded on our door, I realized the gravity of my situation. This wasn't just about a divorce anymore. Becky was setting me up for assault, maybe even attempted murder. The police burst in, guns drawn. Hands where we can see them, they shouted. Becky collapsed into theatrical sobs. He just snapped when I said I wanted a divorce, she cried. He grabbed a knife from the kitchen and came at me. As they handcuffed me, reading my rights, I caught Becky's I won last time. Behind the fake tears was a gleam of triumph. She'd orchestrated the perfect revenge. The holding cell was freezing. I sat on a metal bench, still trying to process how quickly my life had unraveled. Just hours ago, I was a respected man with a home and family. Now I was being booked for assault with a deadly weapon against my wife. Wilson, a tired-looking officer, called. Your lawyer's here. I hadn't even called a lawyer yet, but I followed without question. In a small consultation room, I found Harold Barnes, the divorce attorney I'd consulted earlier in the week. Andrew, he said grimly, shaking my hand. Your neighbor Bill called me. Said he saw you being hauled away in cuffs. Becky set me up, I said, my voice hoarse. She cut herself and called the cops, claimed I attacked her. Harold's eyebrows shot up. That's extreme, but not unheard of. What evidence do they have? Her word against mine. A bleeding woman, a knife with my fingerprints, and a husband who just found out his wife was cheating. They've already decided I'm guilty. Did anyone witness what actually happened? I shook my head, then stopped. Wait. I started recording on my phone after she cut herself. I don't know if it captured anything useful, but it's something. Harold's expression brightened slightly. Where's your phone now? In my personal effects. They took it when they booked me. I'll request access to it immediately. In the meantime, don't talk to anyone about the case. Not the police, not other inmates, not even your mother if she calls. After Harold left, I was returned to my cell. Sleep was impossible. I kept seeing Becky's face, the cold calculation in her eyes, as she destroyed my life with a single phone call. Had she planned this all along? Was this her exit strategy if I ever discovered her affairs? Morning came with more bad news. Harold returned looking grave. Becky's filed for an emergency restraining order, an emergency custody of Tyler. She's also frozen your joint accounts and credit cards. My stomach dropped. She can't keep me from my son. Unfortunately, with these accusations, she temporarily can. But here's some good news. I got access to your phone. The recording doesn't show the actual injury, but it clearly captures her saying, "Nothing will save you from this. I'm going to make you suffer until you die." It also shows her coaching herself before the police arrived. It's not a slam dunk, but creates reasonable doubt. I felt a glimmer of hope for the first time since the handcuffs went on. So what now? Now we fight back. I've submitted the recording to the DA's office. Your arraignment is tomorrow morning. With this evidence, we have a good chance of getting you released on bail. And Tyler. Harold's expression softened. One battle at a time, Andrew. First, let's get you out of here. Then we'll fight for your son. As he left, I leaned against the cold wall and closed my eyes. Becky thought she'd won, but she'd made one critical mistake. Before I could even react, Karma stepped in and took care of everything. She hadn't known I was recording her. The arraignment came and went like a blur. I stood before the judge, pleaded not guilty, and listened as Harold presented the audio evidence. The prosecutor looked increasingly uncomfortable as my phone recording played in the courtroom. Your Honor, Harold argued, this recording clearly demonstrates that Mrs. Wilson threatened my client and fabricated the assault. We move for immediate dismissal of all charges. The judge, a stern-faced woman in her 60s, studied the prosecutor. Counselor, do you wish to proceed given this new evidence? The prosecutor requested a brief recess to consult with his colleagues. When court reconvened, his demeanor had changed completely. Your Honor, in light of the new evidence, the state requests additional time to investigate the circumstances surrounding Mrs. Wilson's allegations. Translation: they weren't sure they had a case anymore. I was released on my own recognizance, with a court date set for the following month. The restraining order remained in effect, meaning I still couldn't go home or see Tyler, but at least I wasn't behind bars. As we left the courthouse, Harold handed me a hotel key card. I've booked you a room for the week. We need to move quickly with the divorce proceedings. Becky's shown her hand, and it's worse than we thought. I spent the afternoon in Harold's office, building our counterattack. We filed emergency motions to unfreeze my accounts and establish temporary visitation with Tyler. Harold also helped me secure a new phone and laptop, since all my electronics were still at the house. There's one more thing, Harold said as our meeting concluded. The detective assigned to your case wants to speak with you. Informally. Detective Malone was waiting at a coffee shop near Harold's office. He was younger than I expected, maybe mid-30s, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. Mr. Wilson, he said, shaking my hand. Thanks for meeting me. Am I walking into another trap? I asked bluntly. He shook his head. Just the opposite. I've reviewed your recording multiple times. Something didn't add up from the beginning. The blood pattern at the scene was inconsistent with your wife's story. The angle of the cut suggests self-infliction. My heart raced. Are you saying you believe me? I'm saying evidence doesn't lie. People do. He sipped his coffee. We're reopening the investigation, this time looking at Mrs. Wilson for filing a false police report and obstruction of justice. She tried to send me to prison, I said, still processing the reversal. And she might find herself there instead. Detective Malone handed me his card. Call me if she contacts you in any way. In the meantime, we'll be building our case. As he left, I sat back, almost dizzy with relief. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt the tide turning. Becky had overplayed her hand. Her attempt to destroy me had backfired spectacularly. That evening, my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. It was Tyler, calling from his friend's house. Dad, are you okay? Mom won't tell me what's happening. Hearing his voice, I nearly broke down. I'm fine, buddy. Everything's going to be all right. I promise. Over the next 2 weeks, my life existed in a strange limbo. I moved from the hotel to a small furnished apartment, started working remotely, and waited for the legal wheels to turn. Harold had become not just my attorney, but my lifeline to normalcy. We have court tomorrow for the financial and custody hearing. He informed me one afternoon. I've subpoenaed all your bank records. Becky spent over $12,000 since freezing you out of the accounts. On what? I asked, incredulous. Designer clothes, spa treatments, and, here's the kicker, a weekend at the Riverfront Hotel with one of her boyfriends. Harold's eyes sparkled with the gleam of a predator who'd cornered his prey. The judge is going to love that. Meanwhile, Detective Malone had been building his case against Becky. He'd interviewed our neighbors, Tyler's friends' parents, and even Becky's coworkers. The picture emerging was damning, a pattern of lies, manipulation, and carefully cultivated appearances. I was granted supervised visitation with Tyler. Our first meeting was awkward. He'd clearly heard Becky's version of events. But as we talked, his teenage skepticism worked in my favor. Mom won't really explain what happened, he admitted as we played basketball at the community center. Just says you lost control. But that doesn't sound like you, Dad. People can surprise you, buddy, I said carefully. But I need you to know I would never, ever hurt your mom or anyone else. He studied the basketball in his hands. I found some weird stuff on Mom's computer. Text messages to guys I don't know. Photos that were, His face flushed with embarrassment. My heart sank. You shouldn't have had to see that, Tyler. I told Detective Malone, he continued. He came to school to talk to me. I showed him the messages. I froze mid-dribble. You did. Tyler nodded. Mom's been acting weird. Crying 1 minute, angry the next. She keeps saying we're going to move away once this is all settled. I don't want to move, Dad. I hugged him tightly, knowing Becky would be furious if she knew what he'd told me. One day at a time, okay? The truth has a way of coming out. That evening, Harold called with news that made my head spin. The DA's office is dropping all charges against you, he announced. And they're filing charges against Becky for filing a false police report, obstruction of justice, and attempted fraud. What fraud? I asked, stunned. She tried to refinance your house yesterday, using forged signatures. The bank flagged it and contacted authorities. Jesus, I whispered. There's more. Detective Malone executed a search warrant on your home computer. They found detailed conversations between Becky and her lovers discussing how to get rid of you and cash in on the house. One of them has already flipped on her, hoping for immunity. I sat down heavily. She really wanted to destroy me. Instead, she destroyed herself, Harold replied. The arraignment for her charges is scheduled for Monday. And Andrew, we're requesting full custody of Tyler. Karma works in mysterious ways. For Becky, it arrived on a Wednesday morning in the form of 2 police officers at our, now her, front door. I wasn't there to see it, but our neighbor Mrs. Peterson called me immediately. Andrew, they just took Becky away in handcuffs. What on earth is happening? Detective Malone confirmed it an hour later. She's been arrested on multiple charges: filing a false police report, obstruction of justice, conspiracy to commit fraud, and attempted grand theft. The evidence against her was overwhelming. The forensic analysis of her wound confirmed it was self-inflicted. The text messages between her and her lover's detailed plans to get Andrew out of the picture and cash in on our assets. One of her boyfriends, Marcus, had turned state's evidence, providing detailed statements about Becky's plot. She told us you were abusive. Marcus had claimed in his statement. Said you had controlled her for years, and she needed to escape. I believe her at first. Later, I realized she told the same story to at least 2 other men. The court lifted the restraining order against me, and I was allowed to return home. Not that I wanted to live there anymore. The house felt tainted, full of betrayal and lies. I went only to collect my personal belongings and Tyler's most treasured items. Tyler chose to stay with me in my apartment. The court granted me temporary full custody, while Becky was held without bail, deemed a flight risk after investigators discovered she'd recently applied for passports for herself and Tyler. She was planning to run, Harold explained during our meeting, probably to disappear with one of her lovers once she'd secured enough money from your assets. The divorce proceedings were expedited given the criminal charges. The judge had seen enough evidence of Becky's deception to grant me favorable terms: primary custody of Tyler, the majority of our assets, and protection from any of Becky's debts. As I signed the final divorce papers, I felt no triumph, just profound sadness for what might have been. Tyler was quiet on the drive home, staring out the window at the fall leaves. Is Mom going to jail? He finally asked. I don't know, buddy. I answered honestly. That's up to the courts. I'm sorry she did those things to you, Dad. I reached over and squeezed his shoulder. None of this is your fault. We're going to be okay. And for the first time in months, I actually believed it. 6 months after that fateful night in our kitchen, I sat in a courtroom watching Becky in a tan jumpsuit, her once perfect hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She looked smaller somehow, diminished by the consequences of her own actions. The trial was mercifully brief. With a mountain of evidence against her and Marcus's testimony, her attorney advised her to accept a plea deal. She pled guilty to filing a false police report, attempted fraud, and conspiracy, in exchange for a reduced sentence. As part of the agreement, she had to make a public statement acknowledging her lies. She stood, hands shaking slightly, and addressed the court. I falsely accused Andrew Wilson of attacking me. I deliberately cut myself and called the police, claiming he had assaulted me with a knife. Her voice was flat, emotionless. I did this to gain advantage in our divorce and to secure financial assets. I deeply regret my actions. Not a word about Tyler. Not a single apology to me for trying to destroy my life. Even now, she couldn't show genuine remorse. The judge sentenced her to 18 months in prison, with eligibility for parole after 12. She would also be responsible for all court costs and my legal fees. As I led her away, our eyes met briefly. What I saw wasn't the woman I'd married, but a stranger, cold, calculating, and angry at being caught rather than sorry for what she'd done. Outside the courthouse, reporters clustered with cameras and microphones. I declined to comment, hurrying to my car where Tyler waited with my sister. He'd refused to attend the sentencing, saying he wasn't ready to see his mother like that. "Is it over?" he asked as I slid into the driver's seat. "The legal part is, for now," I answered honestly. "The rest takes time." That evening, as Tyler did homework at the kitchen table of our new house, smaller than our old one, but untainted by bad memories, I realized something important. Despite Becky's best efforts, she hadn't broken us. Tyler was adjusting well at school, making new friends, joining the basketball team. I was moving forward professionally, even dating occasionally. The life Becky had tried to destroy was rebuilding itself, stronger than before. There was a certain justice in that. 2 years is a long time in a teenager's life. Tyler was now 17, taller than me, with college applications spread across our dining room table. He'd bounced back better than I could have hoped, excelling in school and basketball, with a small circle of close friends who knew our story but didn't define him by it. Becky had been released after serving 14 months. She now lived in an apartment across town, working a retail job, a far cry from a prestigious marketing career. Our divorce agreement granted her supervised visitation with Tyler, though he rarely chose to see her. The hurt went too deep, the betrayal too personal. "Dad," Tyler said one evening as we grilled steaks on our patio, "Coach thinks I have a shot at a scholarship to state." "That's fantastic," I replied, genuinely proud. The university was only an hour away, close enough to come home on weekends, but far enough for independence. "Mom called today," he added casually. "Said she wants to come to my graduation." I kept my expression neutral. "How do you feel about that?" He shrugged. I told her I'd think about it. "She's still my mom, but it's complicated." I finished for him. "Whatever you decide, I'll support you." He nodded, relieved. "Thanks, Dad." As for me, the path to healing had been slower but steady. I'd sold our old house, unable to erase the memories of that night. The new place was smaller, but felt more like home. I've been promoted at work, my colleagues rallying around me after the truth came out. Detective Malone occasionally checked in, having become something of a friend. "You know," he told me during our last lunch, "in 15 years of police work, I've never seen someone handle such a betrayal with your kind of grace." I wasn't sure about grace, but I'd worked hard not to let bitterness consume me. Therapy helped. So did joining a support group for men who'd experienced similar betrayals. Hearing their stories reminded me I wasn't alone. Dating again had been the hardest part. After Becky's deception, trusting anyone seemed impossible. Yet gradually, I'd opened up enough to form a relationship with Diane, a pediatrician I'd met at one of Tyler's basketball games. She understood the baggage I carried and never pushed for more than I could give. Sometimes people ask if I regret marrying Becky, given how things ended. The answer is complicated. Those years brought pain I wouldn't wish on anyone, but they also gave me Tyler and lessons about resilience I couldn't have learned any other way. If there's one thing I've learned, It's that karma doesn't always work in mysterious ways. Sometimes it's perfectly straightforward. Becky thought she could destroy me for her own gain. Instead, she lost everything that mattered while I rebuilt something stronger from the ruins. As Tyler and I finished our dinner on the patio, watching the sunset paint the sky, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel again after all that happened: contentment. Not perfect happiness, but a deep, abiding peace. We were going to be all right.